Greetings. My name is Tariq Cyril Amar. This is the fourth episode of my podcast, The Ninth Wave. Today, I would like to talk about a recent development in the Israeli genocidal campaign against the Palestinians, specifically in Gaza. Of course, the Israelis are committing many crimes as well in the West Bank. Before I do so, I would like to explain something about my perspective today, my approach, as it were. I would like to focus in this particular podcast, in this episode, on a few questions that have to do with international law, to be more precise, what is called international humanitarian law. Another name is the law of armed conflict. And that is, in essence, the law that regulates what you can do in a war as a combatant, as an army, as some other armed organization, and what you must not do, even in war. This is not the law that regulates when you may have a right to fight. That's something else. This is the law, the body of laws, I should say, that tries to regulate how you are allowed to fight and what things you're not supposed to do, even when you fight. Right? Before I go into details, I would like to preface this discussion with addressing a sort of fundamental problem, which is that you may very well ask, why bother with the law at all? Why bother with international law? Why bother with international humanitarian law? Isn't it all a charade anyhow? And the reason why you might very well ask that is that the elites of the West or the global North, it's largely overlapping, I think we all know who we are talking about, including, of course, the criminal elites that run Israel, which in itself is a rather criminal enterprise, I'm afraid to say, have made it very clear to us now that they don't care about the law at all. Or, to be precise, they only care about the law when they can use it to their own advantage. Right? This is something that some people call legal nihilism or nihilism, an attitude towards the law that is completely instrumental, completely cynical, and brutally hypocritical, because the same elites will, of course, at the same time tell everybody else around them, that is the rest of the world, all of us, that we must abide by the law because the law is so important, right? In the eternal words of the foreign policy chief of the European Union, these are the elites of the garden, all the others are part of the jungle. And the garden, of course, claims to be very lawful and to also impose the law on others. And at the same time, as we see very clearly, this garden, this West, this global North, does not give a damn. Even in cases, clear cases of genocide, as is now happening by Israel against the Palestinians. So again, you might very well say, why bother with the law at all? I have two reasons why I do think we should still do that. One reason is that I personally do not want to be forced by these legal nihilists to become one myself. I would like to insist that the law does matter. I think the law is in principle an excellent idea, and I don't think I'm a wishy-washy idealist here. The problem is the law has to apply equally to all, as it does not at this moment. And here's the second reason why I think we should still bother with the law, including international law, including the law of armed conflict, which is that the limits of history are really not the limits of our imagination. This has been proven again and again and again. The record is very clear. History can surprise you very easily, actually. I think that we may not actually, in the not so far away future, that we may quite soon be in a world where the law will matter even for these Western elites and even for the criminal Israeli elite. Not because they want it, not because they will change their mind, but because they will lose enough power so that the law can be applied to them and can be imposed on them. And that will be a glorious moment once it happens. Once again, I can't predict this, obviously, but I do think we cannot rule out that possibility. Put it in a nutshell, my dream for the future is that the Israeli genociders and their accomplices in the West end up in Palestinian courts, not even international courts. That's good too, if it happens. Palestinian courts, that's where they most belong. I'm not giving up on thinking that that might actually happen, maybe even in my lifetime. And then the law will be needed. So, after this introduction, let me talk about the specific occasion for my little episode today, for my podcast, which is that on Monday, an anonymous Israeli official, brave as they are, an anonymous Israeli official, has let it be known that in the case of a ground attack, a ground invasion on southern Gaza, essentially on the city of Rafah, right? That in that case, Israel would tell the Palestinian civilians to be precise, to go to a place called Al Mawazi. And the idea behind this, and it's a very mendacious idea, I will explain why, is the pretense that, oh, we might come in and wage a huge battle against Hamas and its allies, against the Palestinian resistance, the legitimate Palestinian resistance in reality. But we are going to be so kind to tell all these civilians, and there are more than 1 million, many of them have been displaced before by the Israelis, to go to this Al Mawasi and they're going to be okay. That's the pretense, that's the lie. Now, let's talk about what Al Mawasi is. Al Mawasi is basically a glorified beach. It's a very long, very narrow strip of coastal area. You might think that sounds like Gaza. Exactly. Gaza is a very, very small place. It basically has the surface of the mid ranking city of Atlanta in the USA, if you want a comparison. And Al Mawasi is a much, 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 much smaller place inside Gaza on the coast. Desperately small. It is 700 to 800 meters wide, more or less half a mile if you think in miles. And it is about 13 to 14 kilometers long, which is about 9 miles. Right? This is a glorified long beach, and it is already overcrowded because the Israelis have driven Palestinians there before. We will talk a little bit more about this in a second. So, on the face of this is already an absurd idea. But I think there are a few points that we should note, obvious points, but I would like to make them explicit nevertheless, which is, first of all, this announcement, this statement by this Israeli official, reminds us that as far as the Israelis are concerned, Rafah is still on, in the sense that they have not given up on the idea of launching a devastating, as is their style, major ground operation into Rafah. Don't get me wrong, they have been bombing and massacring people there anyhow. This is about something else again, which is come in with large amounts of tanks and infantry and wage what doesn't really deserve the name battle. I would say commit another large massacre on the ground. Right? They haven't given up on this idea. It may be true that this statement also indicates that they have given up on something else. If you remember, there are many indications, there's plenty of evidence that this operation as a whole, that has been going on now for more than 7 months, was planned to completely ethnically cleanse the Gaza Strip, to get all about 2.3 million Palestinians out, either via the sea or into the Sinai Desert in Egypt. And the way to do that the Israelis were clearly trying to implement, is to terrorize them by genocide, to wage a genocidal campaign inside Gaza and destroy whatever people need to live in Gaza, make Gaza uninhabitable for its current inhabitants, the Palestinians. And so, out of a combination of, I really can't live here any longer, it's just not possible, and also they're murdering us at a rapid rate, force the Palestinians to leave in their entirety. It is true that this, at least in this announcement, this declared idea of forcing them to yet another place inside Gaza might indicate that even the Israelis have finally understood that this plan has been defeated. And it has been defeated, of course, most of all by the Palestinian resistance, by Hamas and its allies. Right? Nevertheless, we don't know that. We are speculating. What I think isn't speculative is that the statement by this Israeli official about Rafah and invading Rafah with ground forces once again shows us something we all know, if we're halfway intelligent, I would say, namely that all those American urgings, right, this American theater, are completely irrelevant and worse. We know that American officials have been in touch with Israeli officials discussing the modalities of such a ground operation, right? In effect, saying something along the lines of, well, if you do this, please be really humanitarian and make sure the civilians are okay. This is, of course, complete nonsense. If the United States wanted Palestinian civilians to be protected, it would have to do two things: immediately stop supporting the Israelis. It should have done that in October, obviously. And in fact, if we lived in a normal world, well, then we should put together a UN army, right, an intervention force, and go in there and protect the Palestinian civilians. That's what would happen in a normal world, right? So, what the United States, what the Biden administration are offering us instead is, I would say, spin for suckers, to put it in American terms, who still believes those really, I'm sorry, primitive lies about that Biden is talking to Netanyahu and Biden wants this and Biden wants that and we are trying to restrain the Israelis. This is all nonsense. In reality, Washington is a co-perpetrator. I would use that term, not even accomplice. They're very close, obviously, but I would use the stronger co-perpetrator in the Israeli genocide. That's what they are. And all that talk about trying to somehow mitigate the Israeli violence is a lie. So let's get to the legal aspects. As I explained at the beginning, I think it is still worthwhile talking about them. Now, I would like to start with something very basic, namely a fundamental principle of this international humanitarian law, this law of armed conflict. It's often called the equal application principle. And I'm going to read out a basic summary that I've taken from a professional website, and that's as good as any others here. The law applies to all parties, that is, to everyone fighting in this conflict, right, or in any conflict. And let me say right away, this is not only about state armies. This also concerns, of course, applies, binds, but also it protects non-state actors. Right? The law applies to all parties. That principle holds regardless of which side attacked first. This is very important because, as you know, Israeli propaganda, Hasbara propaganda in the West as well, tries to pretend that Hamas, that the Palestinian resistance attacked first on October the 7th. Now, the fundamental problem with this is it is very clear to all of us, is that, of course, the Hamas operation, think of it what you want, was not initiating the war. The war has been going on for a long time, and if anybody attacked first, it's Israel. Again and again and again. And what Hamas did on October the 7th was already a response. Right? Okay. Now, let's set that aside for a moment and let's sort of accept, just for the sake of argument, the idea that we pretend that this all started only with the attack by Hamas. Here's the point. What I've just read out to you means that this doesn't free Israel from having to obey international humanitarian law. Nobody gets to say in war, oh, they struck first, and therefore I can now do what I want to them. That is nonsense. International humanitarian law has been constructed deliberately in such a way that you must obey, even if you feel that the other side has struck first. It just doesn't work that way, right? Second, the law applies also irrespective of whether the initial attack complied with international law. Now, think about this. Again, Israeli propaganda, Hasbara trolling, right, is pretending that Hamas' 7th October attack was nothing but a huge terrorist killing spree. As we all know, this is wrong. In reality, the attack targeted military targets, in particular, several bases of the Gaza division. And in fact, they routed the Gaza division. And because under international law, and this is very, very clear, Palestine has a right to armed resistance. These attacks, Hamas attacks or whoever, against military Israeli targets were perfectly legitimate. There's absolutely nothing criminal about it, whatever the Israelis say. Now, in addition, there were Israeli allegations of horrible atrocities. It has now turned out that many of these atrocities simply did not occur. Right? So this is important. Then there are also substantial numbers, hundreds of killed Israeli civilians. I won't go into the complications that have to do with the status of armed settlers and so on. Let's set that aside for a moment, okay? Let's just give them that. There were hundreds of killed civilians. 2 points. First of all, we now know, it has been acknowledged even by Israeli media, that many of these civilians were killed by Israeli forces in an application of the so-called Hannibal doctrine. That means before we let any Israeli fall into the hands of our opponents, the Palestinians, we kill them ourselves. That is in essence the Hannibal doctrine, and it was generously applied on 7th October, which means that Israel killed a lot of those civilians. Okay. Let's assume, and this is a realistic assumption, that there were civilians killed by Hamas, right? Now, again, under the laws of armed conflicts, if Hamas killed these civilians not deliberately and not negligently, that is, if its fighters were making an attempt, a sincere attempt not to kill civilians, then even that isn't a crime. You might not like to hear this, but this is how this works. However, I too assume that Hamas and other fighters did kill some civilians on 7th of October deliberately, and that is a crime. That's a war crime. Okay. But here comes the point. Let me read to you again what I've just read to you from the principle of equal application of international humanitarian law. The law applies irrespective of whether the initial attack complied with international law. This means that even if Israeli claims that Hamas did all of these terrible things were true, and most of them are untrue, but even if they were true, Israel would still have to comply with international humanitarian law. Takeaway point number 2. You cannot go into war and say, oh, the other side has been so terrible and they've committed such horrible crimes that now I can do whatever I want. Wrong. This is explicitly, completely wrong. International humanitarian law will still bind you. That's just the way it is, except apart from everything else that I've just discussed. Now, here's another point. The law applies to all parties, irrespective of which side is acting in lawful self defense. Now, as you know, Israel claims to be acting in self defense, and that claim is false. Right? This is another area of international law, but the claim is 90% false. There is a little bit of wiggle room, but it's really small. The claim is basically false because Israel is an occupying power. Occupying powers have, by definition, no right of self defense. It doesn't exist for them. It's the way it is. And now let's again play the same intellectual game here. Let's give the Israelis their lie. Let's for a moment, just for a moment, say, okay, fine, we assume it's self defense, right? Against the facts. Even then, what I've just read out to you means that they still have to obey fully international humanitarian law. There's just no difference there, right? Even the lie doesn't make a difference. So, this is just as a preface to say that when we discuss any Israeli behavior and whether it is compatible with international humanitarian law, the law of armed conflict, then we need to keep in mind all these Israeli techniques to give off this vibe that somehow this stuff doesn't apply to them. Oh, yes, it does apply to them entirely. There are no exceptions, and there are none for them either. So now let's go into some detail here, right? What we have just talked about at the beginning of our episode is that an Israeli official has in essence threatened, right, to displace Palestinian civilians into a very, very small area, right? This in itself is obviously wrong, right? But let's think about the place of displacement, as it were, under international humanitarian law. Now, I've said at some point already that there are some distinctions in this body of laws between conflicts that are exclusively between states and conflicts that also involve, as it were, organizations. Right? You could think Hamas is an organization, it's not a state. But I think you'd be very mistaken there. It is true that Hamas itself is not a state, but it is actually acting for a state. Palestine is a state. So, in this context, let us remember that another Israeli obfuscation technique should not work on our minds, namely pretending that somehow Palestine is not even a recognized state. It is absolutely a recognized state. Almost 140 states on this planet, and there are about 200 only, right, recognize Palestine. And this is the 2022 figure. So there might be a few more by now, right? They recognize Palestine. Palestine is a recognized state. You may say, what's going on at the UN? Because at the UN, the Israelis and their allies give us this impression that if the UN says no, which is totally wrong, to allowing Palestine finally have full membership, that means it's not recognized. It's a completely different matter. Completely different matter. Palestine is already a recognized state, which makes the scandal of not letting it have full membership, like any other state virtually in this world, just bigger. Palestine is a recognized state. So, in fact, these distinctions between conflicts with non-state actors and conflicts that involve only states, they're really pretty much irrelevant in this case. And the main reason is that actually this is an interstate conflict, right? Now, however, let's see what international humanitarian law has to say about displacement in all of these cases anyhow, right? And here is a summary from the International Committee of the Red Cross. That is the gold standard on international humanitarian law. They actually helped create much of it, right? And they're still very active in it for good reasons. So here's a summary of from the International Committee of the Red Cross. Displacement parties, let me put it like this: displacement is not allowed of civilian populations in whole or in part unless there are two exceptions. The security of the civilians involved demands it, the security of the civilians involved demands it, not of the attacking army. That's not a point, not of the attacking state. The security of the civilians involved demands it. Or there is what is called imperative military reasons. Now let's look at these two exceptions, right? These two places where international humanitarian law does open a door to displacing civilians. The first one is very easy to deal with. The security of Palestinian civilians does certainly not demand displacing by Israeli forces. And this is an empirical question. This is not a matter of speculation. We have had 7 months of this genocidal campaign now, and we know that in this case, it's very clear Israel has a pattern of using displacement to kill even more people. It is definitely not taking care of the safety of civilians by displacing them. It is facilitating even more violence against them. That is what's really happening. Remember that area Al-Masawi or Al-Mawasi that is actually under consideration for displacing these over 1 million people from Rafah into this glorified beach? Israel has displaced people there before from the north of Gaza, and it has bombed people there before. And this is typical. Israel has a sterling record of asking Palestinian civilians to go to a certain place and then killing them there. Right? So this cannot possibly have anything to do with the safety, the security of these civilians, and that's the first exception allowed. This one doesn't apply. Now look at the other one. Imperative military reasons. What could they be? Right? You might think, oh yeah, maybe that works. No, it doesn't. And I tell you why. First of all, Israel could argue we have a reason, and that's we have to liberate those hostages still held by Hamas. All of Israel's behavior in this genocidal campaign up until now, however, has clearly shown that they don't care about the hostages. I'm absolutely certain that many hostages have been killed by Israeli fire, in fact, because Israel doesn't care about them. It doesn't care about their lives. It doesn't care about them returning. I think that the Israeli leadership, in fact, has made up its mind to give up on them and that they're better off dead because then they can't come back and inconvenience them with telling them, for instance, that Hamas treated them fairly well and that what they were most afraid of was Israeli bombing. There have been cases where Israeli forces have directly, not just by bombing, but really shooting them from close range, killed Israeli hostages, right? So the hostage argument definitely doesn't wash, not for reasonable people. Israel could say, well, but we have to fight Hamas. Okay, but your whole strategy of allegedly fighting Hamas, we get to that, I don't think that's the real issue here, of allegedly fighting Hamas hasn't worked at all. In fact, Hamas, with terrible sacrifices, the Palestinian resistance as a whole, which isn't only Hamas, have inflicted a defeat on you. You haven't got what you want. After 7 months, how can you claim a military reason for doing more of this insane approach? Doesn't work. I'm sorry. And here is the most fundamental reason. Israel is not actually waging a war. They call it the Israeli-Hamas war, but that's a euphemism. War is bad enough, but Israel is not waging a war. Israel is waging a genocide, right? And you cannot possibly claim a military imperative inside a genocide. Doesn't compute at all. So Israel has totally no right to displace these Palestinians, these Palestinian civilians. Right? That is one important point. But there are others. There are others. So let's for a moment look at how international humanitarian law, especially since 1949, there's a specific history behind this, looks at civilians. And the basic message is international humanitarian law demands strong protection of civilians. We know, I understand that this has very often been disobeyed. Everybody knows this, right, since then. But that is still the demand of the law. Very strong protection for civilians without discrimination among them. And here comes the next point. Having said that, international humanitarian law also says there are a number of categories of civilians who are especially protected. They are all strongly protected, but these ones especially so. And now let's look at these categories. It's actually very interesting. Women and children. You know that Israel has killed extraordinary numbers of women and children, and I think quite deliberately. You should know that it is, so to speak, in double breach of international humanitarian law. Not only were they all protected as civilians, they were especially strongly protected by this law. The aged and the sick. Well, that should make you think about what Israel has been doing to hospitals and generally to all medical infrastructure in Gaza. Not only have they raised it, they have also committed massacres in it. And many of the victims of these massacres will have been the sick, plus the staff taking care of them, and probably quite a few of the aged too. And then there is a fifth category of civilians especially protected under international humanitarian law. And again, this comes from the International Red Cross Committee, gold standard on these things. I quote, those who flee their homes and become internally displaced or refugees. The distinction is you're internally displaced if you don't cross an international border. You are officially a refugee once you cross an international border. In this case, of course, we are talking about the internally displaced. The internally displaced are among the especially protected categories among the civilians that are generally strongly protected under international humanitarian law. And of course, many of the Palestinians who are now in Rafah are precisely that. They are already the victims of prior Israeli displacement. So they have special protection not to be attacked again in an unlawful manner, which this would clearly be. There's one last or a penultimate point that I would like to also raise. I see in the English language sort of social media sphere, traditional media, but also in the German social media and traditional media sphere, a very unpleasant tendency, namely an absolutely wrong, bogus, and immoral idea that somehow that if an army, an attacker, gives a warning to a civilian and says, please, civilian, go out of the way, I'm going to come and fight there, that if the civilian doesn't move, the civilian loses protection. Complete nonsense. It is completely the other way around under international humanitarian law. The civilian never loses protection. So the civilian who complies and is displaced is still protected. And the civilian who does not comply and is not displaced is still protected. So, this whole idea, and I've seen this a lot in the media, that if Israeli officers phone in bizarre little warnings, right, that are probably useless anyhow because people can't receive them, the Israelis give them the wrong maps, it's all bullshit anyhow. But the idea is that if they do this, they somehow then get a you can now commit a massacre and it's okay card. That's wrong. It's completely wrong. Civilians remain protected under international humanitarian law, whether they submit to being displaced or don't submit to being displaced. This is a crucial point. So if the Israelis actually roll into Rafah and start mass murdering civilians there, let nobody tell you that, oh, they were warned, they should have moved away. That isn't only unethical and cynical, it is also completely idiotic. It shows absolute ignorance, either willful or maybe just because people are too stupid to read up on things, of the relevant law that actually exists. Now, I would like to conclude here with another quote, literally from the International Red Cross Committee, a direct quote from one of their publications, very important, fairly recent. And it says, international humanitarian law prohibits forced displacement by intimidation, by violence or by starvation. It's like a catalog of what Israel is doing to the Palestinians. The things that Israel claims are warnings are intimidation, very clearly. There is plenty of outrageous violence against civilians, in particular, because it's a genocide. That's what happens in a genocide. And of course, the Israelis started this murderous campaign with escalating their blockade of Gaza, which was in place since 2007 and was already a crime of collective punishment, and then some, escalating that into what they themselves, the Israeli Minister of Defense himself, Yoav Gallant, publicly called a total blockade. And the total blockade had no other purpose than create a massive humanitarian crisis, starvation, and many other things from which people then die. Epidemics, lack of infrastructure, lack of fuel, all of it together. The blockade was weaponizing and has been weaponizing a humanitarian crisis willfully created as a weapon of mass destruction. Right? So once again, let me read this quote for you from the International Red Cross Committee, absolutely an authority on these matters. International humanitarian law prohibits forced displacement by intimidation, violence, or starvation. It prohibits what Israel has been doing and may be on the verge of doing again to Rafah on a very large scale. Let nobody tell you otherwise. That's all from me for today. It's a sad topic, it's a depressing topic, but of course, there also is a lot of resistance inside Gaza and in the world. So I think nobody has the right to turn that depression into giving up. And if I have been able to make a tiny contribution to clarify a few things that can help to resist the murderous lies that come with this genocide and that are being spread by Israel and by the West, then I'm happy. Then I'm very happy for today. Thank you very much.